in this video, we're going to take another major step towards being able to make a real game, which is you're going to start to touch the user interface system in Unreal, which will be great. What we're going to do with that is very simple, actually. We're just going to end up, I don't know if you can see it even, but there's a little tiny white dot about a third of the way down the screen, and in the middle, it's kind of over the enemy tank right now. That's our aiming reticule. So we're going to make a player UI widget and a tank player controller that's going to spawn that widget, and then the magic will happen. So let's see how it's done. So what we want to create is a little dot in the screen, about a third of the way down the screen and right in the middle. So about where the enemy tank is in our viewport now, something like that. And that becomes our aim point. The simplest way to do that is to use user interface, something called a widget blueprint. And we're going to be needing that anyway to display our ammo and to create our start menu later. So let's get into widget blueprints and user interface. Just before I do, I'm going to delete my high poly model of the ground. You could proceed with high poly modeling. It's just taking a lot more time, and the focus of this section is more on control systems. So I'm going to delete that high poly landscape. And I'm also just going to move the flatland material into the battleground shared assets, just to tidy up. It's as simple as that. Finally, I have a levels folder here, but I haven't used it, _levels. Why underscore? Simply because it floats to the top. It's quite common that we want to choose our level. Later we'll have a start scene in here too. And if you put _levels, it floats to the top of the list. Simple as that. All right, so how are we going to do this? Well, we want to make ourselves our first widget blueprint. So in the Content tab, you go to Add New, look for Widget, or just scroll down for it, and User Interface, Widget Blueprint. That's what we want. Don't worry about Slate. That's a more advanced tool for user interface. We're just going to be messing around with the widget blueprint for now. All right, let's call it player UI, for example. Okay, because it's going to be the player's user interface that we're designing here. Fantastic. So let's go into the widget blueprint. A whole new load of tools for you. Unreal's great like this. It's got so many tools hiding away. So I'm just going to get rid of the animation timeline at the bottom and the animations tab. We simply don't need those. And just keep things nice and simple. Okay, so for the sake of what we're doing here, we actually just need an image. That's all we need. Just a very simple couple of white pixels, to be honest. So what we're going to do is just add an image, drop it in the scene. Now, the first thing we need to get right is the anchoring. We want to make sure it's always anchored to a position that is halfway along the screen and exactly a third of the way down the screen. And the way we're doing things at the moment, if you just drop the image in, the anchor point is at the top left. So let's see what happens if we change screen size. You see how it's anchored a fixed number of pixels away from the top left. That's no use to us. So the first thing we want to do is change this anchor point. Now, the simplest way to make sure that this image is always at 50% of the way across horizontally and a third of the way down vertically is just literally to drag the anchor point there. There you go. So at 50% horizontally, 33.3%, exactly 1/3 vertically. So then this is where it's going to stay anchored to. Look what happens now if we change the screen size. That option is at the top right. You see how it's always a third of the way down the screen and halfway across the screen. Okay, so I'm just going to go 19-inch monitor. It doesn't really matter. We're going to be focusing on a 16:9 ratio. I just wanted to show you that that's going to stay there regardless. Okay, so next question. Where is this block compared to that pivot point? Well, that's these positions on the right-hand side, or not necessarily, depends where you've got your Details tab. But in your Details tab, under the Slot section, you can see Position. And if you reset these positions in X and Y, and also the size, I think maybe 5 pixels will be enough in X and Y. Then we've got a 5 by 5 pixel blob, but it's not quite sitting in the middle of the anchor point. And the reason for that is the alignment needs to be 0.5, 0.5. Okay, you can see that if the alignment was 0, 0, then it's the top left of the image that sits on the anchor point, but we want 0.5, which means halfway across horizontally and halfway up vertically. That's where we want it. So if we zoom all the way out now, what we've got is a little dot that, regardless of the screen size and shape, is going to be a third of the way down and halfway across. Cool. Nice and simple. So I'm just going to call this image something different. Let's call it aim point, like that, and compile the player UI widget. And that is the start. We have a player UI widget. Now, don't be disappointed that when you play your game, it doesn't show. That's because we haven't yet set up the blueprint to make that show, which is what we need to do next. So it's at this point we want to think about what entity is responsible for showing the player UI. Well, you could say it's the tank because it's always there when we're possessing the tank, but how about if we depossess the tank, i.e. our tank gets blown up, for example? What would happen if we weren't actually possessing the tank? Should we still be showing our UI? I think we should. Fundamentally, it's the player controller that is responsible for showing the player UI, or that's the choice we're making in this section. And we don't have a player controller yet. So let's go ahead and make ourselves a new blueprint class. So as we're making a player controller, the type of the blueprint we're going to use is a player controller. Okay, it's an actor responsible for controlling a pawn used by the player. That pawn is the tank and we are the player. So there you go. Let's make that new blueprint. Let's call it player controller or tank player controller, I think. Underscore BP. Why tank player controller? Because we are possibly going to have tank AI controller later when we get to the point of having AI tanks. Great. So in the tank player controller, that is where we're going to set up the user interface. So I'm going to show you how to do that, and then I'm going to allow you as a challenge to do the last little bit. So if we go to the event graph of your newly formed tank player controller blueprint, I'm going to delete the tick for the moment. It's the begin play that we're interested in. Okay, so there's the begin play node. So drag an execution pin from your event play to get your begin play to get things going, and search for widget. One of the things we can do is under the user interface section, which makes sense, we create a widget. So let's do that. Ditch this tab at the bottom. So we are going to create a widget. Now, what's the widget class? We've made it. It's the player UI class. We don't need to worry about an owning player for the moment. That's going to default to us because we are going to be the tank player controller. But what we do need to do once we've created the widget is we then need to add it to the viewport. So if you drag off the execution node and search for add to viewport, then that's what we're trying to do. Now, it needs to know what to add to the viewport, and that will be a reference to the widget we just created. Okay, so let me just explain that a little bit more. The player UI that we're working in here is, if you look at it and you hover over it, it is a widget blueprint. It is a blueprint for making a UI widget. What we're doing in the player controller is saying, okay, go ahead and create an instance of a UI widget from that template, which we've specified here. And once you've got a reference to it, use that to add that widget to the viewport. Okay, so we're nearly there. We're nearly there. If you compile that blueprint and play, you're going to find, unfortunately, that little dot still doesn't show up because there's one final thing we need to do. And I'm going to give you the satisfaction of doing it. So I want you to set the player controller. Find the game mode blueprint for this level. We've already visited that in this section. Set the player controller to be our new blueprint class. And then test that the aiming dot indeed shows up now. So go ahead, pause the video, and do the last bit yourself. Okay, welcome back. So this is relatively simple. One option is the blueprints menu. As long as we're in this level, we'll see Edit Battle Tank Game Mode Blueprint. We go into that, and then under here where it says Player Controller Class, we choose the Tank Player Controller Blueprint. Compile the class and play the game, and you see the little white dot in about the right place? Pretty cool. There you go. So now we have an aiming UI widget, and we have used user interface in Unreal, which will set us up for creating start menus and all sorts of other funs. So see you soon.